All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining this presentation. Should you have any questions, please use the question answers box at the bottom of your screen. Please don't raise your hand, but we'll be sure to answer as many of your questions as possible after the presentation. So if I just go to the next slide here, I don't seem to be able to. There we go. My name is Vincent van der Merwe. I manage the Cheetah Metapopulation project on behalf of the Endangered Wildlife Trust. And yes, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak about our conservation work today. So in a rather weird twist of events, National Geographic, one of our major sponsors, asked me to give a talk tomorrow on International Day for Biological Diversity. And they said I must talk about any transformative moments that I've had in nature. And so obviously I work with carnivores, and I'm not really the most sort of in touch with my feelings kind of guy. But, when your donors say jump, you say how high. And slowly, as I was preparing for this talk for National Geographic, I thought to myself, it's probably quite a lot more interesting than the presentation that I had planned. So my apologies for the change of plan, but one thing that I've learned from National Geographic is that storytelling is certainly a lot more interesting than a general scientific presentations. So here goes the transformative moment that I've had in nature. So the story begins on Samara Game Reserve in the Karoo region of South Africa. It's really one of the most beautiful parts of the country, with its mixture of mountainous grasslands and valley thickets. And on Samara private game reserve lived a not so friendly cheetah called Ariane. She generally avoided the game drive routes. She kept to the thicker vegetation, where she hunted mainly kudus on the mountain cliffs, which is not really typical behavior for a cheetah. But the thing with Ariane was that she was blind in the one eye. So we think she was adapting her strategy to a more ambush hunting rather than long chases, where she would have battled with a depth perception, having only one eye. And she was quite a remarkable cheetah. She survived with just one eye. And in 2009, she gave birth to 3 cubs, despite only having that one functional eye. And she managed to actually raise 2 of these little cubs, both little males, to independence. And this was way before I'd started working for the Endangered Wildlife Trust. I'd just completed my military service for the South African Army. And I'd taken up a position as a high school biology teacher in Mozambique. And I hadn't even entered the world of conservation. But while I was teaching in Mozambique, these 2 young cubs of Ariane were growing up. And, they left mom after 18 months, and they were turning out to be quite a formidable pair of cheetahs. And by the time they were 3 years old, they decided to challenge their fathers for the prime territory on Samara, the prime cheetah territory. And that is the nutrient-rich highland grasslands of Samara, because this area supports the highest concentration of prey species for cheetah. And it's also the only place in Africa where you can see cheetah in snow, temperatures dipping to below -5 degrees Celsius in winter. It's really a very interesting place. And up on these highlands, you'll see a lot of springbuck, you'll see a lot of blesbuck, you'll see a lot of black wildebeest, which is different to the blue wildebeest in East Africa. You'll see a lot of eland. The eland are, of course, too big for cheetah, but they can take their young. There's mountain zebra, which is a different zebra species found up in these mountains. And so one day, these 2 young male cheetahs wandered up into the prime hunting grounds of Samara. And when they went up there, they bumped into their fathers. And their fathers, of course, fiercely defended their territory, and a brutal fight broke out. And in the process, unfortunately, these 2 young cheetahs killed their fathers. And of course, reserve management were not happy because their fathers were the prime game viewing animals, while these two males were similar to their mother. They were not great for game viewing. They preferred to stay away from game viewers and game viewing routes. And so a decision was taken to immobilize these two young males and to remove them. And this was mainly because you know, now that they were going to be the dominant males in Samara, there was an inbreeding threat that they would potentially breed with their sisters or with their mother. So we decided, a decision was made to move them to Gondwana Game Reserve, which is 350 kilometers south of Samara, and they were driven down there. And whenever we relocate cheetahs, we always put them into a release boma on the new reserve. So this is basically a small fenced area, half the size of a football field, just to break their homing instinct. And cheetah are like all other cats in that regard. They have a homing instinct. And when you move them far away from where they come from, they simply walk back. And in order to prevent this from happening, we always put them in the release boma for 2 months to break this homing instinct. And this also allows the cheetah to get used to their new surroundings, most importantly, allowing them to realize what dangers lurk in their new neighborhood. And unfortunately, that same day that the two new Samara males arrived at their new reserve at the boma in Gondwana, the lions immediately realized that there were two new arrivals. And lions they sniffed these cheetah out and immediately went to the release boma to visit them. And lions have an inherent hatred for all other cat species and will actively try to kill them. So these two brothers got such a fright when they saw these lions that they tried to dig their way out of the boma. And in the process, one was unfortunately killed. But the remaining brother escaped well before his homing instinct was broken, and unfortunately was never again seen on Gondwana. We assumed that he was dead. During this time, I'd completed my master's degree at the University of Cape Town. And during my undergrad and master's degrees, I specialized in entomology and birds, ornithology. So that's insects and birds. And I really had no background in carnivores. But the first job advert that I spotted was a position advertised by a very prestigious conservation NGO in South Africa called the Endangered Wildlife Trust. And this position was titled Cheetah Metapopulation Manager. And I thought what I'd do is I'd give it a go, and I submitted my application, despite not having a background in carnivores. And it was an interesting time. You know, if we look at what had been happening in South Africa, you know, with cheetahs, they'd been completely wiped out from 95% of their historical range during the colonial period. You can see as the colonials moved up from Cape Town north into the country, they slowly wiped out cheetah populations. And by the 1960s, there were only 400 cheetahs left in South Africa in 2 reserves. But in a very positive development in our country, since 1994, cheetah were reintroduced into 31 newly created reserves across the country. Slowly, since the 1960s, we've been reintroducing cheetahs into smaller fenced reserves in South Africa, but only after democracy did this really accelerate. Their reintroductions accelerated because we experienced a tourism boom in South Africa, and these tourists wanted to see our charismatic wildlife, including our cheetahs. And in a period of 15 years after democracy, you know, we filled up a number of reserves with cheetah, reintroduced cheetah into these reserves. And the problem with these reserves, unfortunately, though, was that they were fenced. So there were no more opportunities for natural gene flow between these reserves. We have a law in South Africa that says if you want to reintroduce carnivores, you have to fence your protected area. And just so that you understand what a metapopulation is, it's basically a series of disconnected populations, where species, for example, the cheetah, have been reintroduced. This is a managed metapopulation, not a natural metapopulation. The cheetah have been reintroduced into these reserves. And then once you have your metapopulation established, you have to move individuals between the reserves to prevent inbreeding. So that's basically what my job is to move cheetah between these reserves to prevent inbreeding. So to my disbelief, the Endangered Wildlife Trust employed me to solve this problem. And I was given a Land Rover, 2 capture cages, and I was told to move cheetahs between reserves to prevent inbreeding. And this all sounded terribly exciting, but you know, I recall initially running around the country not really knowing what I was doing. I felt as if I was thrown in the deep end. I was an insect specialist and I had no experience in capturing wild cheetahs. And to make matters worse, this was just after the global financial crisis, and many of the reserves that we were working with were selling cheetahs to captive facilities in order to make profit. And in just a very short period, we lost almost 50 wild cheetahs to captive facilities, to Tiger King type facilities. And this was incredibly depressing, obviously very depressing to see a wild-born cheetah go into captive conditions. And it obviously had severe impacts on our wild metapopulation. Between 2009 and 2012, we lost almost 25% of our population, with the numbers dipping from 281 to 217 cheetah. And, you know, this was very frustrating. Cheetah do not belong in captivity. They belong in the wild, where they've been doing what they've been doing for millions of years, you know, and that is catching their own food and avoiding competing predators. Cheetahs are, of course, one of the weakest of the large predators. So they really are, they do live a very tough existence out there, because all other competing predators are persistently trying to catch them and kill them. And also the problem with captive breeding is that, you know, we really don't want to see our cheetah going the way of the wolf, where it took humans just 15,000 years to turn this wild functional animal into all the breeds of domestic dog that we see out there. And we really don't want to see the cheetah go the same way. And we do see this happening in certain captive facilities, where there's aggressive selection for color morphs, for unusual cheetahs. So we already started the process of domestication in cheetah. And you know, during this initial period when we started this project, we kept on hearing reports of a rogue cheetah running around in the Eastern Cape. And you know, people were seeing him on farmland, on roadsides. There were reports of leopards killing livestock. I remember phoning all the reserves in the area and asking them if they were missing a cheetah, and could they account for all of their cheetah, and they all assured me that they had no escapees. And then the final blow to our project came when the only funder of our work, who was the son of one of the wealthiest men in the USA, captured 2 of our wild cheetah and stuck them in cages in his own personal garden. And this was a really devastating day for us. You know, no matter how much money he was giving us, and it was a lot, this was where the Endangered Wildlife Trust really drew the line and pulled the plug on our relationship with him. And this now left us without any funding whatsoever. So incredibly demoralizing. You know, I'd studied for 7 years with the ultimate goal of making a positive contribution to conservation in Africa. And this project was failing dismally. Our numbers were declining. We had no funds. And I was honestly, you know, to be honest, contemplating an alternative career path. And although my seniors never told me, I'm sure that there was talk in the corridors of head office about the future viability of the project. And while this was going on, we got a phone call from a farmer in the Eastern Cape, and he'd caught a rogue cheetah in a cage trap, and this cheetah was responsible for killing 34 of his goats, and he told us if we don't remove it immediately, this cheetah would not be alive in the morning. So we got a veterinarian and we hopped in a vehicle and we shot down to the Eastern Cape, and we went and we immobilized this cheetah. And when we immobilized him, we immediately scanned him for a microchip. By law in South Africa, when you move wild cheetah between reserves, you have to chip them with a microchip so that you can identify them if you've lost them. And so I scanned his tail for a microchip, and the scanner made a bleeping sound, and I couldn't believe it. There was his chip number, and I'll never forget that chip number. The last 6 digits were 2266041, and I plugged this number into my computer, into my database, and I couldn't believe when I realized that this was the male that had escaped from Gondwana 7 months earlier. He was the remaining brother of the coalition that had killed their fathers on Samara, and was the last remaining son of the blind female on Samara. It was really a remarkable feat. You know, in a period of 7 months, he had walked over 350 Ks exactly in the same direction that he came from. And he was caught just 50 kilometers short of Samara. It must have been an incredible journey. You know, we have no idea what he got up to during that period, that 7-month walkabout, but we suspect that plenty of sheep must have disappeared and many rounds of ammunition must have been fired by angry farmers. He must have crossed the Outeniqua Mountains, which is a really big mountain range between Gondwana and Samara, and it's really not cheetah habitat. You know, it's comprised of very dramatic terrain with thick shrubby vegetation where we know cheetah never occurred historically. So how he survived walking over these mountains is really beyond us. It must have been something quite remarkable. It was a remarkable achievement. But once he crossed these mountains, he would have entered into the Karoo region of South Africa, a vast semi-arid region that occupies 40% of our country. And here he would have feasted on some very tasty Karoo lamb, and during this period, he would have learned how to traverse fencing. And he must have crossed at least 150 sheep farms before he was finally caught. When we went to collect him, we loaded him in my vehicle and we transported him 1,200 kilometers northwards, right across South Africa to a reserve in the Waterberg region of South Africa. And it was a very well-fenced reserve. We've specially selected that reserve because we knew, you know, that he was an expert at moving through fencing. And the Waterberg is a beautiful part of South Africa. It's got rugged, mountainous terrain, and it supports a large number of wild lion, wild dogs, leopard, and cheetah. And he did exceptionally well in the Waterberg. Immediately after arriving, he met up with a local female and he sired 3 young cubs, 2 males and a female. And, you know, this was the beginning of a very long line of genetically strong cheetahs that would become established in the metapopulation. But old tricks die hard, and the Darlington male kept on escaping. He was an expert at moving through fencing, as you can see in the left-hand corner of this camera trap photograph. He literally used to dig his way under electric fences. And we'd never really seen this kind of behavior in cheetah before. And we were consistently having to recapture him. So I thought I'd just include some slides on, you know, how we capture wild cheetah. So basically, they generally have play trees or scent marking posts where they mark their territories and sharpen their claws. And they always defecate at the bottom of these scent marking posts. So what we normally do is we put capture cages at the base of these scent marking posts, and we basically collect thorn branches, and we place the thorn branches around the play tree in such a way that the only way the cheetah can get to the plate tree or the scent marking post is through the cage trap. And one day when we were sitting in the office, we got an SMS from one of our camera traps, and it showed a picture of our Darlington male literally walking into the cage trap. So this was incredibly exciting. We'd managed to recapture him, and we jumped into our vehicles and raced off to go and collect him from the cage trap. And when we arrived on the scene, we were greeted with absolute heartbreak. You know, this cheetah, the Darlington male, had literally smashed his way out of the cage trap. And yeah, this was all very depressing. We had to send the cage trap back to the factory for reinforcement, because we were really dealing with a really, you know, a very hardened cheetah here. And we thought we'd probably squandered our only chance to capture him, but we really underestimated his obsession for Calvin Klein. A zoo in the United States figured out that cheetah really love the smell of Calvin Klein, especially obsession for men. And yeah, so he really loved the smell of this Calvin Klein. And 1 week later, we caught him in exactly the same cage trap. And of course, it was a big celebration. And we managed to get him back into the reserve where we had him, Dino King. And he did, you know, his offspring did exceptionally well in Dino King. They also turned out to be really formidable cheetahs. And he's, you know, a year after 2 years after his sons were born on Dino King, we relocated them to a game reserve called Pilanesberg in 2018. And there we obtained this incredible footage of an interaction between leopards, a leopard and the two sons of the Dino King, the Darlington male.
Yeah, those are moving. All right, guys, just it's still okay? Guys, sit still.
It was really remarkable footage. Never before had we seen cheetahs challenge leopards like that. We know from our data in the metapopulation that 9% of cheetah deaths are due to leopard. So it was really quite remarkable to see for the first time a cheetah coalition beating up a leopard. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And my colleagues from Panthera, who I share an office with at the University of Cape Town, they all work on leopards. So it was really great for me to finally have some evidence of cheetah giving leopards a good bashing. So we also obtained some really remarkable footage of the daughter of the Darlington male interacting with lion. And you can see in this video, you know, after we relocated her to a reserve very close to Kruger National Park, you can see how clever female cheetah are when they interact with lion. You can see her cubs moving away in the background, and you can see how she moves towards the lion, pulling them away from the cubs, getting the danger away from her cubs.
Well, at least I followed
So that was some really lovely footage, and the next day we found her alive with all 3 of her cubs, and she still survives to this day. So my interactions with the Darlington male were really a transformative moment for me in nature. His sheer tenacity and will to stay alive convinced me to stay in cheetah conservation. I would have felt a great sense of betrayal if I had abandoned the cheetah metapopulation at that stage. And because the genetic lineage of a tenacious animal like this really needs to be preserved in future wild cheetah generations. And so myself and the Endangered Wildlife Trust decided to persist with the cheetah metapopulation project. And we had some really good news to follow. National Geographic had heard about our cheetah conservation efforts in South Africa, and they threw our project a lifeline with some urgent capital. And this was becoming a National Geographic explorer was really one of the proudest moments in my conservation career. And not only was this a lovely achievement, but also we finally had some money to keep the project going. And so we immediately set about finding allies to help us fight the trade of wild cheetah into captivity. And what you'll learn in conservation, if you work in conservation, is that for many years you study about the biodiversity and the diversity of life on Earth, but it really is all about working with people. And if you work by yourself, it's going to be an impossible task to stop the tide of human destruction. You really need to surround yourself by as many allies as possible so that you can work together with them to stop further human destruction of the environment. And like they say in life, you should always surround yourself with people that have your best interests at heart. And we found some wonderful allies in the process, especially a lady called Nolotando Bam from the Eastern Cape government, and a gentleman called Brent Coverdale from Ezemvelo KZN Wildlife. And these 2 individuals and a whole lot of others, including Karen Swart, helped us to completely halt the trade of wild cheetah to captivity. After 2014, we didn't lose a single wild cheetah to captivity ever again in the South African metapopulation. And this was really a wonderful breakthrough for the project. And immediately our population started to grow. From 217 cheetah in 2012, we slowly started to increase in numbers to 241 in 2013, 287 in 2015, 336 in 2017, and now we've almost doubled our population. We're now sitting on 386 cheetah. And it was really great to see the population recover like that. And this is a really encouraging achievement if you think about the status of wild cheetah populations in other parts of Africa. In all other countries, cheetah numbers are in decline. It really is only in South Africa that we're seeing an increase in wild cheetah numbers. And the more I thought about this, we realized that the reason for this is because basically South Africa has this legislation that that states that you have to fence a protected area if you want to reintroduce carnivores. So what the fencing does is it separates agriculture from conservation. It keeps the communities happy because it prevents the carnivores from getting into their land and attacking their livestock. And it also prevents people from coming into conservation areas with their livestock and coming into conflict with carnivores and other large herbivores. And fencing also allows reserves to maximize their conservation contribution by holding cheetah at populations that's significantly closer to their estimated carrying capacity. And this is why Kruger National Park holds the biggest protected cheetah population because it's fenced, and the fencing prevents edge effects on the outskirts of the reserve from harming the wildlife populations. And the problem, unfortunately, with fencing is that it impairs natural gene flow. So that's why my job is to relocate cheetahs between reserves to prevent inbreeding. We call it human-mediated gene flow. And ever since our population numbers started to increase, we've had a lot of surplus cheetah to play with. And in 2017, the project reached a major milestone when we decided to expand our work outside of South Africa, and we relocated 4 cheetah from South Africa to Malawi. And it was a wonderful moment, you know, sitting in that aircraft with 4 wild cheetah behind us, taxiing down the runway at OR Tambo International Airport with a Boeing 747 in front of us and a Boeing behind us. And here we were in this little Cessna flying to Malawi. And, you know, flying over Malawi, you really begin to see, you know, the reality of the situation in Africa. Long gone are the wide open spaces for wildlife to roam freely. You know, we only left with tiny little fragments of natural habitat. And it's very easy to see where the protected areas are in Africa because they're the only little pieces of greenery. And as we flew those cheetah over Liwonde National Park, you could see exactly where the boundary of the reserve was. On the right-hand side is the natural vegetation, and on the left-hand side is complete destruction of the landscape by humans. So it's no longer possible for cheetah to move through that human-dominated landscape. And that's why we have to do the moving for them. And the release of wild cheetah back into Malawi, a country where the species went extinct in the 1980s, was a major step forward for the project. And it was so interesting watching those cheetah released onto Liwonde National Park with the assistance of African Parks, who'd done a wonderful job of clearing that area of human destruction and snaring and poaching. And the wildlife on Liwonde really, hadn't seen large predators in over 30 years, and they almost didn't know what to do when they saw the cheetah. It was very easy for the cheetah to capture prey initially. And it was the strangest thing to see baboons sleeping on the ground at night, you know, because they just hadn't seen a leopard in over 30 years. And of course, this all changed with the reintroduction of cheetahs and lions and so forth. And the cheetah did exceptionally well in Malawi. We started off with 4 cheetah, and immediately our population started to increase. We now have 25 cheetah in Malawi. And despite the lion reintroductions into Liwonde, the population continues to grow. And we've subsequently reintroduced cheetah into Mozambique Wildlife Reserve, and there are opportunities for establishing a metapopulation in Malawi itself. And when I was driving back from Malawi after doing the post-release monitoring, I thought, let me just quickly pop into Gorongosa while driving through Mozambique and ask them if they may be interested in cheetah reintroduction. And I was a bit disappointed when they said they weren't interested, but they would definitely take a pack of wild dogs. And we couldn't believe it. Just a few months later, the Endangered Wildlife Trust flew in a pack of wild dogs. And thanks to the wonderful work by the Karoo Foundation, you know, we now have 2 packs of wild dogs in Gorongosa. So it goes to show there's a lot of organizations doing great work on the ground in Africa, creating safe space for carnivore reintroductions. And we're really trying to align ourselves with organizations like African Parks, Peace Parks, and the Karoo Foundation. And the project has gone from strength to strength ever since. You know, I've had some wonderful opportunities to work in all kinds of places, including a visit to Iran, where the only remaining population of wild cheetahs in Asia remains. We've managed to work closely with the Department of Environment in Iran to convince them to release a whole bunch of captive cheetahs that will almost certainly breed better in more natural conditions in the wild. And we're hoping to have some success over there. It's been a wonderful privilege to go and work in places like Namaqualand when, you know, after the first spring rains, there's this massive boom of flowers, and to go to West Africa to work with African Parks in that part of the world, to see West African cheetah for the first time. You know, we had a major breakthrough in West Africa when we managed to obtain the first genetic sample for a West African cheetah. And as part of my research, we're going to try and establish the genetic placement of West African cheetah. Are they more closely related to Southern African cheetah or to East African cheetah or to Asiatic cheetah? And the initial findings suggest, very interestingly, that they are actually closely related to Asiatic cheetah. It hasn't all been fun and games. There's been some very disappointing moments too. You know, during a visit to Somaliland, I had first-hand experience with the illegal trade of wild-born cheetahs from East Africa into the Middle East. All of these wild-born cheetahs going into captive conditions in houses, in living as pets in houses in the Middle East. And this is one of the experiences that I had. Sitting here with Najum Jimmy. She's driving. How are you doing, Najum? You okay? We're seeing the ugly side of the trade of wild cheetahs from East Africa to the Middle East. I don't think this cat's going to be alive in the morning. I think we're going to lose her tonight. And in the back of the car here, I have with me 8 young cheetah cubs. I think we may be down to 7. I don't think one has made it. So yes, it's you know, very depressing, some of the things that are happening, and the illegal trade of wild cheetahs into captivity continues to be a major thorn in our side. And you know, during all my travels to all these interesting places, we've kind of managed to almost figure out what's happened with wild cheetahs in the last 13,000 years. 13,000 years ago, you know, cheetah used to occur right across Africa, except for the more forested regions, right across the Middle East, all the way north into Russia, and all the way eastwards into India. And over this 13,000 year period, you know, cheetah have been lost or extirpated from 91% of their historical range. And if you look at, I'm going to quickly speed through these slides. If you look at where cheetah are today, you know, 13,000 years of agriculture in the Middle East has resulted in only 40 cheetah left in that part of the world. Whereas we've only had 1,500 years of agriculture in South Africa, in Southern Africa. And that's why we are the conservation stronghold. That's why we still have 4,500 cheetahs. So it goes to show that the varying levels of human influence in the 4 geopolitical regions where cheetah occur have had varying consequences for these cheetah. The longer an area is subject to human disturbance, the less likely you are going to find cheetah in that area. And the really bad news, I suppose, for cheetah conservation is that, you know, despite the massive human population growth over the past 13,000 years, we're still going to see a doubling in human population numbers in Africa in the next 80 years. And this is going to make our work really hard. You know, we as conservationists have really got our work cut out to keep these genetic lineages alive and well. And but working with a cheetah in South Africa and in Malawi has been a real eye-opener. You know, we've learned that it's an incredibly adaptable species. They can adapt to environments with very different climate, with very different prey densities, with very different densities of competing predators. We've got 3 Kalahari desert reserves that have cheetah. We have 8 thicket reserves, very thick vegetation that support cheetah populations. We've got 9 Karoo reserves that support cheetahs. We've got floodplain grassland reserves in Malawi where temperatures reach up to 50 degrees Celsius with cheetahs. And they go from snow to these hot temperatures without problems. And we've got 16 Lowveld savanna reserves that have, with high leopard densities that support cheetah populations. We've got 3 grassland reserves with cheetahs. We've got 18 mountainous savanna reserves that support cheetahs. We've even got 2 coastal dune forest reserves that support cheetahs. And when we move cheetahs between all of these reserves, we know that there's roughly a 50% chance that that relocated cheetah will survive at least 2 years post-release. The only real difference is when we move them into the Karoo. And the Karoo is a very tough place to be a cheetah because it's very rocky. And cheetahs have to walk very far to find prey in an environment like that. And they can't always use their speed to capture prey in such a rocky place. And we move cheetahs between the reserves because of the genetic rules. And these rules state that, you know, for any mammal species, it doesn't matter if you're a mouse or a whale, you need at least 1,000 individuals for a genetically viable population. And unfortunately, most cheetah populations in Africa are well below that. And that is why it's so important to introduce a managed metapopulation approach to cheetah conservation. But the story of the Darlington male is not the only interesting story. You know, of course, when it comes to cheetahs, there's so many other cheetahs across the continent that have similar stories. And in fact, the general evolutionary story of the cheetah, how it fits into the cat family, is another really, really remarkable story. And I thought I'd just share this with you, you know, before we close off. So cats evolved in Southeast Asia 11 million years ago. And that's where they split from the Lynxangs. There's only 2 species of Lynxangs, and they evolved into a very successful family. There's 41 species of cat today that occur on 6 continents, 6 of the 7 continents. And they moved from Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, countries like this, across all continents over the last 11 million years. And the first cats to evolve were the great roaring cats, the larger cat species. The most primitive living cat is the clouded leopard, and that's split into leopards, tigers, snow leopards, jaguars, and lions. And it's very interesting that jaguars are more closely related to lions than they are to leopards, while snow leopards are more closely related to tigers. The next group of cats to evolve were the bay cats, which are found in Asia, 3 species. The first cats to move into Africa crossed the Sinai Peninsula about 1 million years ago, and they were the Caracal lineage, which includes servals, caracals, and the golden cats. And then in a very interesting development between 6 and 11 million years ago, when sea levels were very low, a whole lot of 3 cat lineages moved into the Americas. And this includes, they crossed the Beringian land bridge there between Russia and Alaska. And these 3 lineages included the ocelots, beautiful cats. There's about 7 species of ocelots. The lynxes, there's 4 species of lynxes, and the pumas. And it's very interesting that the closest living relative of the cheetah is actually the puma. In fact, cheetahs actually evolved in North America. And we know this from the fossil record, where 2 species of North American cheetah had a very puma-like appearance. And it's very interesting that the speeds attained by the second fastest land mammal actually evolved in response to predation by the North American cheetah. And we don't know why cheetah went extinct in North America, but we know that before they went extinct, they once again crossed the Beringian land bridge back into Eurasia. And some of the lynxes also did. And in Europe, about 2 million years ago, existed the largest of all the cheetah species that lived, called the European giant cheetah. It's about the size of a female lion and weighed about 120 kilograms. And we have no fossil evidence for how they got to Africa, but we know that they somehow crossed into Africa about 1 million years ago, where they persist today. So a very interesting evolutionary story, the evolution of the cheetah. And I thoroughly hope you enjoyed this presentation. And please feel free to bombard us with any questions that you may have. A very big thank you to our sponsors. A massive thank you to PwC for covering my salary, for being the primary funders of the project. A very big thank you to National Geographic for funding much of our expansion work into the rest of Africa, to the Ford Wildlife Foundation for supplying me with a wonderful new vehicle to do the work with, and also to Ceramed for supplying a lot of the monthly costs of the Metapopulation project. So thank you very much for checking in. I'm sorry if I kept you all a little bit over time, but I'm going to hand over to our IT team at headquarters in Johannesburg, and please feel free to ask any questions. Thank you very much. All right, so I can see a whole bunch of questions coming through. All right, sorry, I'm actually doing this presentation from my vehicle because I didn't have very good cell phone connection this morning, so I had to drive up a hill to get good connection. But yes, some very interesting questions coming through. The first one is with regards to the reintroduction of cheetahs into to India. And thanks very much, Femke, fellow National Geographic explorer, for that question. So, of course, you know, Indian cheetahs are not related to African cheetahs. As far as we know at this point in time, they are a separate subspecies which has evolved, you know, over a few million years, sorry, a few 100,000 years, separately from African cheetahs. So they are definitely something different. So would it be ethical to use African cheetahs for reintroduction into India? You know, that's a whole question on its own. But, you know, if we ever do get to that point, and if we know that we are going to lose the cheetah in Iran, then we certainly can look at using African cheetahs. And we have the reintroduction expertise to do this. We have the animals available to do this. And if our genetic analysis shows that West African cheetah are actually very close to Asiatic cheetah, then it would be advisable to use West African cheetah for that reintroduction. So there's some further talks coming through. Thanks very much to Chloe from National Geographic for the support. She's based in Rwanda and drives operations for Nat Geo in Africa. A question from Tadeo Rusoki, the total population of cheetahs in South Africa. We have the third largest wild cheetah population worldwide. It's only Namibia and Botswana that have larger wild cheetah populations. And although we you know, we work with fencing in South Africa, it would be a very bad idea to implement fencing in a place like Namibia or Botswana, because these two countries still have very large connected wild cheetah populations. So so in places like that, it's best to work with communities, not to put up fencing, and to try and keep those cheetah populations going. There's 1,400 cheetah in both Namibia and Botswana. So they are the largest cheetah populations worldwide. I see some questions with regards to cheetahs in snow, asking if it's an adaptation. And I think it's not really. You know, cheetahs have for millions of years lived in very cold conditions in Europe And in the cold ice ages, you know, every 100,000 years, Earth goes through a cold period. Cheetahs would have survived these cold periods. And so they definitely are adapted to surviving in cold conditions. I see we have some further questions about the blind cheetah. Is it common that a female mates with several males? Yes, this is a very interesting aspect about cheetah conservation. You know, for me, as the manager of the metapopulation, I obviously want healthy genetics, and the more varied partners a female cheetah has, the better it is for ensuring genetic diversity. And yes, female cheetah are very promiscuous. They actually they mate with several males when they come into season, and you can actually sometimes have male cubs with different fathers in the same litter, which is great for genetic diversity. I see there's a question on an assessment on the impact of all the recapture and translocation releases on cheetah well-being regarding stress and other harmful emotional effects. And this is a very difficult thing to grapple with, you know, when managing wild cheetahs. You know, it's not natural to catch a wild cheetah and to put it into a box and to drive it for between 3 and 50 hours to new reserves. You know, some of our relocations from South Africa to Malawi were over 50 hours. So it's very stressful for cheetah in such a confined area. And we've lost a lot of cheetah to chronic stress when moving them. But, you know, you have to balance up the risks and the benefits. Would you rather inbreed your cheetah, or would you rather risk losing 5% of them when relocating them between reserves? And you know, we do have the only growing wild cheetah population. So we are growing our population by about 30 cheetah per year. So we're willing to take those risks, relocating them between the reserves to prevent inbreeding, because it's much more important to prevent inbreeding than to you know, feel sorry for the cheetah because of the severe stress that they experience when relocating them between between reserves. And we have published on this. We have a scientific publication on this matter, and we're getting much better at relocating cheetahs between reserves. In the beginning, we were losing up to 20% of the cheetah that we relocated, and we're now down to 5%. So that was a really valid question. Looking down here for some questions with regards to parasites. Of course, when we relocate cheetahs between the reserves, they get exposed to a whole new different group of parasites in their new environment. So cheetah in the Karoo are used to Karoo ticks, whereas cheetah in Zululand are used to savanna ticks. And so we've only surprisingly lost one cheetah to tick toxicosis when moving them between reserves. So it goes to show how resilient they are to ticks and adapting to different tick species. We actually just spray them with a little bit of frontline, which you use for domestic dogs before relocating them. So that just gives them a little bit of a breather, allowing them to get rid of their tick loads before we relocate them to new reserves. I have another question here about plans to assist other Southern African countries to increase their cheetah numbers. And yes, we've just started doing a lot of interesting work with Peace Parks Foundation in Mozambique. We've got some really exciting reintroductions planned for Mozambique, for Zinave National Park, Maputo Special Reserve, Maromeo Wildlife Complex, and possibly Gorongosa in future. So, and Karingani, which is a wonderful reserve on the Mozambican side of Kruger National Park. So a lot of really exciting work planned for Mozambique, and then also potentially further reintroductions into places, new reserves in Malawi and Zambia. And now that African parks is moving into countries like Zimbabwe and Angola, this could also present us with opportunities to reintroduce into that part of the world. So interesting question, our long-term measure of success for the metapopulation. So at the moment, of course, we're on 390 wild cheetahs. We really want to reach 1,000 one day, because then we know we have a genetically viable population that has enough genetic diversity to persist well into the future. If we have enough genetic diversity to give the cheetahs an opportunity to survive the effects of climate change, to adapt to climate change, to adapt to new diseases that they're going to encounter in future, then we really are on the right track. And to be able to do that, we need to ensure that our cheetahs remain genetically healthy. We have an interesting question here on the role of captive cheetahs in the metapopulation and wild cheetah conservation. And we have a relationship with only 3 captive facilities. There's only 3 of 60 captive facilities in South Africa that have agreed to actually supply us with animals to provide unrelated genetics. And these facilities are Ashia Cheetah Conservation, De Wild, and Hoedspruit Endangered Species Center. And we just started experimenting, or not experimenting, trialing the release of captive cheetah into wild reserves. And surprisingly, it's gone very well. You know, we've lost a few to predators like lion and leopard and hyena, but more than half of them have actually survived and learned to avoid these competing predators. So it's really, this is a nice new source of unrelated genetics, and hopefully those animals will do well. Yes, the West African cheetah certainly are very different from Southern African cheetah. They're a lot paler, much smaller spots, and that's because they've been separated from Southern African cheetah by the Congo forest for more than 80,000 years. So it's really really interesting to see how isolation between populations can encourage separate evolution and the production, and basically what will happen in the very long term is that these populations may even separate into different species. So the interesting question there on the coastal dune forest reserves that support cheetahs. They're both down in Zululand. They're Pinda Private Game Reserve, which is one of our most successful metapopulation reserves, and Mkuzi Game Reserve, where cheetah have also done well historically. We've had a few problems recently with a lot of cheetah lost in unfortunate circumstances, but the 2 coastal dune forest reserves are Pinda and Mkuzi. I think I've got one more time for one more question. But there's a question about measures to fight the illegal trade of cheetah from the east to the west. This is a very difficult question to answer. You know, it's very difficult to operate in countries like Somaliland, Somalia, South Sudan, Chad, Mali, Burkina Faso. You know, we know that portions of Ethiopia, we know that cheetah cubs are being captured in these areas and smuggled through to the Middle East. To get on the ground and to move around on the ground to identify where these cheetah are coming from, to identify the networks, the smuggling networks, it's incredibly difficult to do that kind of work. But hopefully as these countries become more politically stable in future, we'll be able to get onto the ground in those parts of the world and to establish exactly where these wild cheetahs are coming from. So I certainly hope that that answers your questions, and thanks very much for your time. I really hope you enjoyed the presentation.